took 15 minutes to get to Manjola's Inn. From there to Upper Popeshti was about 9 miles. If you walked slowly, that would take 1 hour and a half. A good horse, if it got some food at the inn and rested for 45 minutes, could do it easily. So, 15 minutes plus 45 minutes made 1 hour. Then 1 hour and a half more to Popeshti made it 2.5 hours. It was already past 7. I needed to be with Pukovnik Yurdake by 10 at the latest. I was a bit late. I should have started earlier, but he was waiting for me. I was thinking about this when I saw far away, about as far as a gunshot, a lot of light coming from Manjola's Inn. It was still called that, even though the husband had died 5 years ago. What a capable woman. She had worked hard and made the place better. They were going to sell the inn while her husband was alive. But after he died, she paid off the debts, fixed up the house, and even built some stone steps. Everyone said she had a lot of money too. Some thought she found a hidden treasure. Others thought she had magical powers. Once some thieves tried to attack her. They tried to break down the door. One of them, the strongest, a man like a bull, swung an axe, but when he tried to hit the door, he fell down and died. His brother tried to talk, but couldn't. He was mute. There were 4 of them. They put the dead man on his brother's back, and the other 2 carried his feet to take him away and bury him somewhere. As they were leaving, Madame Manjola started screaming from the window, "Thieves!" Then, suddenly, the sub-prefect appeared with many men and 4 soldiers on horses. The official shouted, "Who's there?" 2 of the robbers ran away. The mute man stayed behind with his dead brother on his back. What happened at the trial? Everyone knew the mute could talk. How could anyone think the mute man was really mute? They hit him a lot to make him talk again. But it didn't work. After that, the boys didn't want to attack the place anymore. While I was thinking about this, I got to the inn. Some carts were waiting in the yard. Some were carrying wood down the valley, and others were carrying corn up the hill. It was a cold autumn evening. The drivers were warming up by the fire. That's the light I saw from far away. A stable worker took my horse to give him some food. I went into the room where people were drinking. 2 gypsies were playing music in the corner. I was hungry and cold. The damp air had made me shiver. "Where's the boss?" I asked the boy behind the bar. "She's by the kitchen fire. It must be warmer there," I said, and walked through the tap room into the kitchen. The kitchen was very clean, and it smelled fresh, not like the tap room, which smelled of fur, boots, and wet shoes. It smelled like newly baked bread. Madame Manjola was busy with the oven. "Nice to see you, Mrs. Margioala." "Welcome, Mr. Fanica. Can I get something to eat?" "You can even eat until midnight, for good people like you." Mrs. Margioala quickly told a servant to set the table in the next room. Then she showed me the food options. Mrs. Margioala was very pretty and strong. I knew that, but she seemed even more attractive to me that day. I had known her for a long time. I used to pass by Manjola's Inn with my dad when he was alive, as the road to town went by it. I was young, bold, and not always very clever. I came up to her while she was working by the fire and grabbed her waist. Her right arm was as strong as iron, and I felt like pinching it. "Aren't you busy?" she said, looking at me strangely. To cover up my mistake, I said, "You have amazing eyes, Mrs. Margioala. Don't try to flatter me. What do you want to eat?" She replied, Give me yourself," I said, trying to be romantic. "Really? You really have wonderful eyes, Mrs. Margioala." I sighed. "What if your father-in-law heard you?" she teased. "What father-in-law? What are you talking about? You think you're hidden under your hat, but everyone can see what you're up to. Aren't you going to Mr. Yurdakes to propose to his oldest daughter? Stop looking at me like that and go eat in the next room." I had seen many clean and quiet rooms in my life, but that room was special. The bed, the curtains, the walls, and the ceiling were all white like milk. And there were beautiful lampshades and crochet decorations of all kinds. It was warm, like being under a hen's wing, and it smelled like apples and quinces. I was about to sit down at the table when, out of habit from my childhood, I turned to bow towards the east. I looked around the walls, but there were no religious pictures. "What are you looking for?" Mrs. Margioala asked. "Your religious pictures. Where do you keep them?" "Forget about the pictures. They just attract bugs and worms." She was very clean. I sat down at the table and crossed myself as I usually did, when suddenly there was a loud yell. It turned out that I accidentally stepped on an old cat that was under the table. Mrs. Margioala quickly opened the door to let the hurt cat out, and the cold air came rushing in, putting out the lamp. We searched for matches in the dark. I looked here, she looked there. We bumped into each other in the darkness. I, feeling bold, hugged her and started kissing her. She resisted and then gave in. Her cheeks were warm, her mouth was cold, and her hair was soft. Eventually, the servant came with a tray of food and a light. We must have searched for a while because the lamp chimney was cold. I lit it again. The food was great. Fresh bread, roast duck with cabbage, boiled sausages and wine, and Turkish coffee. We laughed and talked. Mrs. Margioala asked the maid to bring out some special wine. That wonderful old wine. I felt so relaxed. I sat on one side of the bed, sipping the last drops of wine from my glass and smoking a cigarette. Through the smoke, I watched Mrs. Margioala sitting on a chair opposite me, rolling cigarettes for me. "You really have amazing eyes, Mrs. Margioala. You know what? What? Could you make me another cup of coffee? Not as sweet as this one?" She laughed. When the maid brought the coffee pot, she said, "Madam, you sit here chatting. You don't know what it's like outside." "What's wrong?" I asked. "There's a strong wind and a storm coming," she said. I stood up and checked the time. It was almost 11 o'clock. Instead of being there for 30 minutes, I had been at the inn for 2.5 hours. That's what happens when you start chatting. Can someone get my horse? I asked. Who? The stable workers are asleep. I'll go to the stables myself. They've enchanted you at Mr. Yurdake's, Mrs. Margioala said with a laugh, blocking my way to the door. I gently moved her aside and went out onto the porch. It was indeed a terrible night. The fires of the drivers had burned out, and people and animals were sleeping on the straw, huddled together on the ground, while the wind howled above them. There's a big storm, Mrs. Margioala said, shivering as she grabbed my hand tightly. You're crazy to leave in this weather. Stay the night here and leave at dawn tomorrow. I can't do that. I pulled my hand away. I went to the stables. It was hard to wake up a stable worker, but I managed to find my horse. I tightened the saddle straps, tied the horse to the steps, and then went back to the room to say good night to Mrs. Margioala. She was lost in thought, sitting on the bed with my hat in her hand, twisting it around. How much do I owe you? I asked. You can pay me when you come back, she replied, staring intently at the inside of my hat. Then she stood up and handed it to me. I took the hat and put it on my head, slightly crooked. I said, looking into Mrs. Margioala's eyes, which looked very bright, I kiss your eyes, Mrs. Margioala. Have a safe trip. I got on my horse, the old servant opened the gate, and I rode out. I rested my hand on my horse's side and looked back. I could see the door of the room over the fence, and Mrs. Margioala's white figure in the doorway with her hand shading her eyes. I rode slowly, humming a happy tune to myself until I reached the road. Then the view was blocked. I thought, here we go, and crossed myself. Just then, I heard a door slam and a cat meow. Mrs. Margioala must have gone inside and accidentally trapped the cat in the door. That cat was always causing trouble. I had traveled a good distance. The storm got worse, shaking me in the saddle. Clouds rushed across the sky, sometimes hiding the moon's faint light. The cold dampness made me shiver. I felt it in my legs and arms. As I rode with my head down to avoid the wind, I started feeling pain in my neck. My forehead and temples were hot, and my ears were ringing. I drank too much, I thought, pushing my hat to the back of my neck and looking up at the sky. But the swirling clouds made me dizzy. I felt a burning pain under my ribs. I took a deep breath of cold air, and it felt like a knife stabbing my chest. I put my chin down again. My hat felt tight on my head. I took it off and put it on the tip of my saddle. I felt sick. It was foolish to have started. Everyone would be asleep at Mr. Yurdake's. They wouldn't expect me. They probably didn't think I'd be dumb enough to ride in this weather. I urged my horse on, but it staggered like it had been drinking. The wind stopped, and the rain eased. Started to get dark and drizzle. I put my hat back on. Suddenly, my head started pounding. The horse was tired, worn out from the wind. I kicked my heels into him and whipped him, but he only took a few steps before stopping suddenly. I looked ahead. I saw a tiny creature jumping and skipping in front of the horse. An animal. What was it? A wild animal? It was very small. I reached for my gun, but then I heard the bleat of a goat. I tried to make the horse go forward, but it turned around and tried to go back. A few steps forward, and it stopped again. The goat again. The horse stopped and turned around. I whipped it and tightened the reins. It moved forward a few steps, but the goat appeared again. The clouds had cleared, and I could see clearly now. It was a little black goat. It ran forward, then back, kicking its hooves and playing around. It even reared up on its hind legs and jumped around with its beard sticking out, ready to butt, making funny jumps and wild moves. I got off my horse, which refused to move forward, and held onto the reins tightly. I bent down to the ground. "Come here," I called to the goat, pretending to offer it some food. The goat came closer, jumping around. The horse snorted and tried to break free. I went down on my knees but held onto the horse. The goat came close to my hand. It was a sweet little black goat that let me pet it and pick it up. I put it in the bag on the right side with some clothes. Just then, the horse convulsed and shook as if it was dying. I got back on the horse. It started running wildly. For a while, it ran fast over ditches, molehills, and bushes, and I couldn't stop it or know where I was going. In the midst of this chaos, with my body freezing and my head burning, I thought about the warm inn I foolishly left. Why did I leave? Mrs. Margioala would have given me a room. Otherwise, she wouldn't have invited me. The goat was moving around in the bag, trying to get comfortable. I looked at it. Its smart little head was poking out, looking at me wisely. I thought of someone else's eyes. I realized I had been foolish. The horse stumbled, and I stopped it, but it tried to move again and fell to its knees. Suddenly, through a break in the clouds, I saw the moon shining on a slope. But something was wrong. It was in front of me. There were two moons in the sky. I was supposed to be going uphill, but the moon should be behind me. I turned to see the real moon. I had lost my way. I was going downhill. Where was I? I looked ahead. A field of corn with uncut stalks. Behind me was an open field. I crossed myself and pressed my tired legs against the horse to help it get up. Then I felt a strong blow on my right foot. I cried out. I had kicked the goat. I quickly put my hand in the bag, but it was empty. I had lost the goat on the road. The horse got up, shaking its head as if dizzy. It reared up, threw me off to one side, and then ran away into the darkness. When I finally got up, feeling very shaky, I heard a rustling in the cornfield nearby. Then, I heard a man's voice saying clearly, "Hey, hey, may heaven protect you." "Who's there?" I called out. "An honest man." "Who?" "George." "Which George? Natrut?" "George Natrut. who watches over the cornfields. Aren't you coming this way? Yes, I'm coming. And I could see a man's figure among the corn. Can I ask, Brother George, where are we right now? I got lost in the storm. Where are you headed? To Upper Popeshti. Ah, to Mr. Yurdake's place. Yes, that's it. In that case, you haven't gone off course. But it'll be hard to get to Popeshti from here. We're only at Hakuleshti. At Hakuleshti? I said happily. Then I'm near Manjola's Inn. Look there. We're behind the stables. Please, show me the way so I don't end up hurting myself. I had been wandering for 4 hours. We reached the inn. Mrs. Margiola's room was lit up, and shadows moved behind the curtain. Who knew who else had slept in that bed? I thought I'd have to settle for a bench by the kitchen fire. But lucky me, someone heard me knocking. The old maid hurried to open the door for me. As I entered, I stumbled over something soft on the threshold. The goat. Can you believe it? It was Mrs. Margiola's goat. It followed me into the room and lay comfortably under the bed. What was I going to say? Did Mrs. Margiola know I was back? Or did she wake up early? The bed was made. Mrs. Margiola. That's all I managed to say. Wanting to thank God that I survived, I raised my hand to my head. But Mrs. Margiola quickly grabbed my hand and pulled me into her arms with all her strength. I can still picture that room. What a bed! What curtains! What walls! All white like milk. And the lampshade and all those crochet things. And the warmth, like being under a chicken's wing. And the smell of apples and quinces. I would have stayed at Manjola's Inn for a long time if my father-in-law, Mr. Yurdake, hadn't dragged me away by force. 3 times I ran away before the wedding and came back to the inn, until my father-in-law, who really wanted me to marry his daughter, sent men to catch me and take me to a small monastery in the mountains. 40 days of fasting, praying, and kneeling. I left feeling sorry for what I'd done. I got engaged and married. Just recently, on a clear winter night, my father-in-law and I were sitting together, drinking wine, when a messenger arrived from the town. He said there had been a big fire at Hakuleshti during the day. Manjola's Inn burned down, and Mrs. Margiola died in the fire. And so the sorceress was burned, my father-in-law said, laughing. And I told the story again for the 100th time. Mr. Yurdake believed Mrs. Margiola put a spell on my hat, and that the goat and the cat were the same. Maybe, I said. She was like the devil, he insisted. She might have been, I said. But if that's true, then maybe the devil can lead to good. First, it seems good, but later you see where it takes you, Mr. Yurdake said. How do you know all this? I asked. That's not your concern, the old man replied. That's a different story.